Hello again everybody and welcome back to Fugit's Blitz, and today we're going to look at the top 5 military errors made by Hitler and the Germans that are considered as crazy decisions, but were actually rather rational. Now, it's easy for us with hindsight to label Hitler, the Nazis and Germany as egotistical megalomaniac crazy people who had really bizarre notions of everything, and a lot of their decisions were in fact mad, especially from a military point of view. But when you dig deeper, you will find that there is a lot of rationale and the decisions aren't as crazy as you think. So we're going to look at 5 decisions that are now considered as crazy and completely fruitless and lopsided, but were actually based on pure rational thought and, for all intents and purposes, based upon sound military judgment. So, starting us off at number 5, we have the Ardennes offensive. Anybody who's watched the 1965 film The Battle of the Bulge could be forgiven for thinking that this German attack was an act of complete and utter folly. In the film, basically, the Germans are attacking the West, which comprises only the Americans, in order to get fuel. Well, that's not the reality. The point beyond the Ardennes offensive, oddly enough, made perfect sense. It was to drive through the Ardennes forest at a point where the Allied forces were effectively split, with the British to the north and the Americans to the south. And it was to push through all the way to Antwerp, effectively encircling the Allies in the north, cutting off one of their deep water ports and preventing them from taking a deep water port, and effectively trying to get the Western Allies to pursue for a peace. Peace was never going to be an easy thing to obtain, because since the Casablanca Conference, when the Western Allies had made it clear they would only consider an unconditional surrender, any attempt by the Germans to force a surrender on terms other than unconditional were, let's be honest, fanciful. But the provisions behind the attack weren't. Had the German offensive succeeded, and don't get me wrong, I mean the early part of the Ardennes offensive were clearly in the favour of the Germans. They smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest. Okay, there were some noble actions, especially around the Bastogne region, with the 82nd Airborne holding out for quite a long time against the odds. But the thing that really turned the battle was the Allies' air superiority. Without that, then the Germans really could have pushed all the way through to Antwerp, and they really could have encircled and split the Western Allies apart, leading to a major rethink. So, contrary to popular belief, the Ardennes offensive is not as mad as many people believe. It is based on rational military thinking, and who knows, had the offensive been successful, there may have been a different outcome to the war in the West. It would have certainly slowed down the Western Allies. It wouldn't have prevented the eventual collapse of the German forces and the eventual surrender, but it may have taken a bit longer for the Allies to get over the Rhine and into Germany proper. Who knows? Moving now on to number 4. Holding the Panzers back during the Normandy landings on D-Day. Now, this one always comes around, and it's mentioned repeatedly that basically Hitler was woken to tell him about the Normandy landings, and the generals wanted the Panzers released to counterattack, but Hitler refused to do so. And everybody considers that an act of madness. But was it? What you have to consider is this. Prior to D-Day, the Western Allies had actually taken and gone to massive lengths to sow suspicion into the Germans. Pathe was in command of an army that didn't exist. There were made-up rubber tanks and wooden tanks and plastic tanks and aeroplanes, all poised along the south coast of the UK. with the overall aim of convincing the Germans that the attack, when it came, would come at the Pas de Calais region, the shortest route from England across the Channel into France. So it's no surprise that the bulk of the German forces were actually positioned along the Pas de Calais and not Normandy, which is actually quite a longer route. Prior to the invasion itself, the Allied forces also dropped dummies from parachutes, again to convince the Germans that all this was a ruse, that they really weren't attacking in Normandy. When the attack and the landings eventually took place in Normandy, Hitler and the High Command believed this was a diversion, with the main attack and the main thrust of the Allies' invasion still coming in the Pas de Calais. This is the reason why the Panzers were not released. If they would have released the Panzers to counter the landings in Normandy, which the Germans really did believe was a feint, that would have left them exposed in the Pas de Calais region, where they really believed the main attack was going to come. It wasn't until much later that they finally realised that the Normandy landings was the main attack, that the Panzers were reorganised and brought down. And eventually they would see action in the breakout of Normandy, in what we call Operation Goodwood, whereby there was a lot of tank battles around the Villers-Bocage region, also known as the Falaise Gap. So whilst we may think now that Hitler's refusal and the German High Command refusal to release the Panzers is an act of madness, it was in fact based on logical and rational military thought. Moving now to number 3, which is one of the most famous battles of World War II, and that being the Battle of Stalingrad. This one's a bit more long-winded because it's basically everything to do with Stalingrad, from the push from Rostov across the steppe into Stalingrad, the splitting of the German forces on the approach to Stalingrad, where the Panzers were removed from the 6th Army, and Hitler's and the High Command's refusal to withdraw from the Stalingrad pocket once the Russians had encircled them. All these things now are seen as an act of madness, that the Germans shouldn't have pushed so quickly into Stalingrad, that the Hitler should not have directed the Panzers elsewhere in Stalingrad, and that they should have allowed the breakout. And it's great with hindsight to look back on these things and say, yes, that should not have happened. But the reality on the ground was something and somewhat different. Interestingly, Case Blue, as the operation was known, was assigned to Army Group South, quite a large army. And that comprised of the likes of the 4th Panzer Army, the 1st Panzer Army, and the 6th Army. And they were tasked into pushing down towards the Volga. En route from Rostov across the steppe, however, the German army experienced very little resistance. In fact, they really were able to push because the Russians were falling back. Up until this point in the war, the Russians had generally held their lines and fought a sort of a battle of attrition, but their tactics had changed, so they fell back into Stalingrad, which led the Germans into a semi-false sense of security. This allowed the German High Command, along with Hitler, to reassess the situation, and in doing so, they decided to split Army Group South into Army Group A and Army Group B, with Army Group A tasked with splitting away and pushing down to the Caucasus to take the oil fields, and Army Group B, comprising of the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, to push onto Stalingrad and basically stick onto the Volga, with the 4th Panzer Army holding back in a sort of reserve at the outer fringes of Stalingrad. Both army groups had initially massive successes. Army Group A did in fact get down, not to the oil fields, but they did get into the Caucasus, and they did raise a flag on Mount Elbrus, the highest mountain in that side of Europe. And Army Group B did in fact get into Stalingrad and take approximately 95% of the city, apart from a few pockets of resistance. In fact, Hitler gave a speech saying that, the Germans had got it, that was it, apart from a few bits and pieces here and there. And the Germans really did believe that they had captured Stalingrad. What they didn't know, however, was that over the Volga, on the other side, along a massive front, the Russians, under the command of the likes of Zhukov and Rokossovsky, were pulling together a massive army who were going to push not through the Volga and not into Stalingrad. The idea was to keep the troops under Chuikov, engaging the Germans in Stalingrad, while the Russian offensive or counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, was to be launched against the very weak flanks north and south of the German forces at their weakest points. This happened, and very quickly the Russians encircled the vast majority, well, the whole of the 6th Army and a vast majority of the other armies involved in Army Group B, except the 4th Panzer Army. Now, this isn't the first time the Germans had been encircled. They'd been encircled before many times, and they'd managed to break out. And it was said at this stage by the likes of Göring that they could airlift the supplies into Stalingrad, and nobody thought anything of it. They all really thought it could be done. They also said that it's not a big deal, there's no need to break out. Once we've broken Stalingrad, we can send a relief column in, it's not a problem. And everybody really believed that the troops from the 6th Army in Stalingrad were to be supplied effectively. Problem was, it was never going to happen. By the time they realised their mistake, they decided to try and send the 4th Panzer Army in to break into Stalingrad, create a corridor to allow the 6th Army to escape. Hitler was a great believer that this would relieve the pressure and therefore stop the rot, so to speak. By the time all this was discovered that it was never going to happen, it was too late. But the fact of the matter is this: the Stalingrad offensive was not an act of folly or craziness. On the ground at the time, it didn't seem as bad as we now know it to be. Yes, Paulus could have broken out once he realised that the relief column was not coming in. Yes, Hitler by this stage had told him to hold his ground, mainly because they'd seen that the Russians had held their ground effectively. And he really believed that the 4th Panzer Army and the Luftwaffe were able to supply the Stalingrad front. Unfortunately, it was never to be. The Germans themselves were at risk of further encirclement and losing Army Group A, along with the 4th Panzer Army. So they had no choice but to leave the 6th Army to its eventual fate, unfortunately. But it was never an act of madness. It was based on rational military thinking at the time. Moving on to number 2, which some people would say is number 1, but I don't. I purely hold it as number 2. Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany declare in war on the United States of America. Now, with hindsight again, we look back on this and say, what on earth was he thinking? I mean, this is just absolutely crazy. But when we dig a bit deeper, we understand the reasoning and the rationale behind it. The Americans were brought into the war by the attack on December the 7th, 1941, by the Japanese at Pearl Harbour. The Japanese, oddly enough, were an ally of the Germans. And Germany, at this point in time, was facing difficulty at the gates of Moscow. Their offensive Barbarossa had not gone according to plan. They had basically slowed down and become entrenched and bogged down, literally at the gates of Moscow. So when Japan declared war on America, and America in turn declared war on Japan, the Germans thought, quite rightly, that if they also come to the assistance of their ally, Japan, maybe Japan would come to their assistance. Because the Japanese had quite a large army based in Manchuria, which borders far eastern Russia. where the Russians had a lot of troops. In fact, they had a huge army of Siberians based in the far east of the country, just in case of this very thing with the Japanese attacking. So by the Germans joining forces and declaring war on America, they had hoped that the Japanese would declare war on Russia and assist them in fighting the Russians, thus relieving the pressure in Moscow and effectively getting the Russians to fight on two fronts, one in their far east and one in the west. Alas, however, the Japanese weren't playing the same game as the Germans, and they never declared war on Russia, and in fact, throughout the entire war, they never once declared any form of hostility against the Russians, eventually resulting in the Russians being able to release all their troops from their eastern frontier, bringing them into Moscow and repelling the German attack at the very gates. Russia, in fact, finally declared war on Japan in August 1945, and neither side had traded blows throughout the duration of the war, something which really did not sit well with the Germans, considering that they were allies and the Germans felt that they did the right thing. So whilst we now consider that the Germans and Hitler declaring war on America is an act of pure madness, the actual thinking behind it was purely politically and militarily rational. The Germans would never have thought that an ally would turn their back on them, and it would alleviate the pressure that they were facing in Russia. Had Japan have done this, then the war in the East may have taken a significantly different turn. So it would be unfair and unwise to say it was truly crazy. Which leads us nicely to number 1, invading Russia. Germany's invasion of Russia in June 1941 is now seen as an act of utter madness, that the Germans would never have won, that they were going to lose completely, and that Operation Barbarossa was both ill-conceived and ill-advised. Well, at the time, nothing could have been further from the truth. Germany's invasion of Russia completely took the Russians by surprise. In fact, so much so that they really didn't face any significant resistance in the opening salvos of Barbarossa. Stalin himself had convinced himself that Germany would never attack and had refused any Soviet firing back, funnily enough. So there was a lot of disarray within the Soviet forces at the initial stages of Barbarossa. The Germans attacked on 3 fronts, Army Group North, Army Group Centre and Army Group South, and all had made significant gains, although Army Group South did get slightly bogged down. Army Group North eventually surrounded and reached St. Petersburg, which was then Leningrad. Army Group South had taken Kiev, surrounded Kiev, and Army Group Centre had taken Minsk and pushed all the way through towards Moscow. Millions, and I mean millions, of Soviet soldiers had by this stage been taken prisoner and killed, and the territorial gains made by the Germans in the opening months of Barbarossa were huge. It got so bad that Churchill and the British instructed the BBC not to report on giving any hope to Russia surviving the onslaught, and they estimated that Russia would collapse in a period of 3 to 6 months. This was a general feeling of all the Western allies, funnily enough, America, Britain, etc., etc. Nobody really believed that the Russians were going to be able to stop this and Germany was going to be successful. But for the fact that Japan then attacked America and Hitler then declared war on America, and Japan did not assist their ally Germany in their war against the Russians, things may have been slightly different. As we saw earlier in point 2, by Japan not attacking in Manchuria the Russians in assistance to their ally, this allowed the Soviets to free up vast resources of soldiers in the Far East, bring them to Moscow, and eventually push the Germans back. That push, however, that was in December 41. The Germans weren't really pushed out of Russia for a long time, and the entire Eastern Front hung in the balance until, realistically, their defeat at Stalingrad. Moreover, their complete annihilation at Kursk. So, the invasion of Russia was not an act of madness. It was not as crazy as people think. The Germans really could have pulled it off, but for other factors. This is the problem though. You know, you can't always rely on those other factors kicking in. And whilst we have hindsight and we know that it was all destined to fail, at the time, that was by no means certainty. I've been fooded. Those have been my top 5 military mistakes made by Hitler that we consider as madness or crazy, which actually weren't. Just a disclaimer, guys. This is by no means glorifying Hitler or the Nazis or what the Germans did in World War II. This is merely a historical, factual video laying down that what we now consider to be stupid errors or crazy errors were in fact based on well thought out, well laid out plans that, from a military point of view, were perfectly reasonable and rational, and nothing more than that. By all means, if you like the content, please subscribe. You can comment and like below. If you wish to, send me an email. Tell me what type of history lesson you would like on military matters during World War II. More than happy to consider any reasonable requests. And until the next time, stay safe, and I hope you enjoy the content.